totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to the Booked on Rock podcast. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. The website, bookedonrock.com. It's another 2-episode week of the podcast. This episode features author Andrew Wilde, who is back on the podcast to talk about his latest book, Phil Collins in the 80s. Phil Collins was everywhere in the 1980s. He had more top 40 singles in the U.S. than any other artist, 14 as a solo artist and 11 with Genesis, along with 2 #1 solo albums, plus 25 solo or group hit singles and 8 #1 albums in the UK. Collins also recorded with a diverse list of artists, including Peter Gabriel, John Martyn, Frida, Robert Plant, Mike Oldfield, Marti Webb, Al Di Meola, Adam Ant, Eric Clapton, Phil Bailey, Band Aid, Marilyn Martin, Paul McCartney, Tina Turner, Chaka Khan, and Tears for Fears. Another 35 albums or singles, many of which were massive global hits. He also found time to tour with Robert Plant and Eric Clapton, in addition to his extensive concert duties with Genesis and as a solo artist. He also performed at Live Aid at both concerts. That's around 600 live concerts in total between 1980 and 1989. There's no doubt that the guy had a busy decade. Amidst the overwhelming commercial success and ahead of any other career plan, Collins was a musician. His ubiquity between 1980 and 1989 hides 10 years of magnificent music, and this book examines his musical output through these 10 tumultuous years. Andrew Wilde is a writer, music collector, and film buff with many books to his name, including recent publications about Queen, Pink Floyd, Dire Straits, and Crosby, Stills and Nash, plus 2 books on Eric Clapton, Every Album, Every Song, and his most recent Eric Clapton Sessions. His comprehensive study of every song recorded and performed by the Beatles between 1957 and 1970 was published by Sonic Bond in 2019. To hear a playlist of Phil Collins and Genesis, plus some of Phil's guest appearances, just head over to the show notes page. Hello again, Andrew. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Eric, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Nice to see you again.
Oh, it's great to see you again. About a year ago, I had you on for your Eric Clapton Every Album, Every Song book.
Yeah, that's done well. It was a good book to do, and I enjoyed it. It was great to chat.
Yeah, and we got you back again, this time for your Phil Collins book, but we do want to also mention you do have yet another Eric Clapton book. We'll get to that towards the end, but let's talk about the book Phil Collins in the 80s. Yeah, he was pretty popular in that decade.
Yeah, absolutely right. So the book takes just the 10 years from the 1st of January 1980 to the 31st of December 1989. You know, those of us who remember, and those of us that were there, that was an era where Phil Collins started off really as, you know, the drummer in a prog band, and finished off as a global mega superstar.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering, and this comes from your book. He had more top 40 singles in the U.S. than any other artist during the 1980s, 14 as a solo artist and 11 with Genesis, along with 2 #1 albums. You add that to his guest appearances on a slew of albums and songs by other top artists of his time. That led to another 35 albums or standalone singles, some of which were massive global hits, and he plays both Live Aid concerts. He tours solo. He tours with Genesis. The guy was everywhere. Of course, movies, television. When did you become a fan of Phil? Was it during the Peter Gabriel years of Genesis, or was it after that?
So I'm not quite old enough to be a fan of Genesis with Peter Gabriel at the time. So I would have been only 9 years old when Peter Gabriel left Genesis. So I think it would have been about 1980 when I first heard of Phil Collins. He would have been, you know, just that guy in Genesis at the time. I remember we did have in the UK a very long-running chart show called Top of the Pops. They were hugely influential. And Genesis appeared on that singing Turn It On Again in 1980. It was a pretty decent hit for them in the UK. I suspect that the first time I heard of him would have been on Top of the Pops singing Turn It On Again with Genesis at the beginning of 1980. And then the following year, In the Air Tonight, which is a song that no one could miss, And the year after that, 82, his cover version of You Can't Hurry Love was a number one in the UK. So it was kind of that period there, 81, 82, where he kind of became more visible to people like me, like a teenager, just really understanding what kind of music there was to be there. I remember the singles from the 1983 Genesis album. So, That's All and Mama and those kind of things. And I think Phil's music has just been around kind of ever since, really. I would have thought the first Gabriel era album would have been Foxtrot, which would have been around about that time. I would have listened to that, but I never really saw a major difference between those two eras of Genesis at all in my mind. Or three eras if you count the four-piece band, I suppose. It was all great music to me, whoever was up the front singing. So no problem for me listening to Genesis with Gabriel or Collins solo stuff or any of that stuff. It's all great music. There's no point in turning any of it down, because why would you?
He took over as lead vocalist in 1976 for the Genesis album A Trick of the Tail, and that was followed by Wind and Wuthering. And there was
probably my favorite two albums by Genesis.
Oh,
really,
yeah?
Those two? Yeah, I think so. They kind of moved away from some of the more tricky and pretentious stuff you could argue they'd done prior to that, and it came a little bit more commercial. And so, I absolutely love those two albums in retrospect, not having known them at the time.
Yeah, and it is interesting. Phil is still finding his voice as the lead vocalist of Genesis. Yeah. He did have a style very similar to Peter Gabriel, at least I thought, until you get to the later albums. There was the EP in 77 titled Spot the Pigeon, which, doing my research, that's the first time I've ever heard of that one. I don't even know if I've ever...
Maybe it wasn't released in US. I wonder if... I think Three Sides Live had some studio tracks on side 4, and maybe that was Spot the Pigeon, but I'd need to check through. But was Paper Late on that album?
Well, Paper Late is on Three Sides Live, definitely. Which is, I love that song too. That's one of my all-time favorite Phil songs from Genesis. Very underrated. I remember it being played on the radio. Came and went pretty quickly, but I love listening to that one. 78, guitarist Steve Hackett was out of Genesis, and it was down to that lineup of Genesis that became so famous in the 80s. Phil on vocals and drums, Tony Banks on keyboards, Mike Rutherford on bass and guitar, and they released. And then there were 3, and this includes the band's first top 10 single in the UK, first top 40 in the US, Follow You, Follow Me. And this leads to the first album covered in your book, which is 1980's Duke. That was released on March 28th, 1980. This has a pair of hits and future Genesis classics, Turn It On Again and Misunderstanding. Turn It On Again would be included in what was called the Duke Suite. What is the Duke Suite, and what is the reason the band decided not to include it in the album?
So it's got two names, really. There's the Duke Suite, or sometimes in concert they called it the Story of Albert. So if you listen to recordings of the time, Phil Collins would say, we're now going to tell you the story of Albert. And it's two parts of the Duke album that were originally planned as one long piece of music. So you've got Behind the Lines, Duchess, Guide Vocal, and Turn It On Again, the first 4 tracks on the album, on side 1, as it would have been in the old vinyl days. And then at the end of the album, you've got Duke's Travels and Duke's End. And originally, as they wrote it, I believe that all those pieces together would have been one long piece of music. If you go onto YouTube, you can find people who've reconstructed and remixed it through. But I think they were moving away from these long pieces of music. Supper's Ready as an example, absolute classic Genesis track, wasn't really what they were interested in doing as the 70s turned into the 80s. They played it that way in concert. It's probably my favorite Genesis moment, now that I come to think of it. That Duke Suite, such uplifting and clever and commercial and entertaining music. But, throughout the 80s, and people who know the music will recognize this. Genesis as a band moved away from their more longer, complex pieces. They tended to play selections in concert all the way through their career. But on their albums, although some of their songs were fairly lengthy in terms of time, they were never particularly complex or as complex as they had been in the 70s. And I think that the Duke Suite is one of those turning points in their career where they consciously moved away from what they've been doing in the past to look at something new. And
then Phil releases his first solo album February 13th, 1981, Face Value. In the Air Tonight and Missed Again, two huge hits.
Yeah.
How did this album come to be? I asked that because this wasn't something where Phil had specific intentions of releasing a solo album, correct?
Absolutely right. So all of this came through personal issues. So Phil went through a divorce in 1979, so the year before Duke was recorded and released. So in response to that kind of emotional period in his life, he wrote a very large batch of songs to try and, exorcise those demons, if you like. And I think at that time in 1979, he'd had no solo writing credits on any album by anyone. I think I'm right in saying that. He wrote some bits of music and the odd lyric here and there, but he'd never written anything solely on his own. So he wrote this very, very personal set of songs. Two of them were used on the Duke album, so Misunderstanding and Please Don't Ask, both originally solo demos that he recorded at home on his own. But when they came back from touring Duke, so this will be spring, summer 1980, he turned his attention to the rest of those songs. Just they were there and he wanted to get them down. He got a new studio in his home. He was on his own. So at face value, the album is actually Phil's original home demos that were later polished up and overdubbed in the studio. And I think it still holds up today as a magnificent piece of work and very personal too.
This was dark too. These were songs that you weren't used to hearing from Phil in Genesis, right?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, probably Phil's most famous song as a solo artist is In the Air Tonight, right? There were probably theories around whether the song was based on anything specific. You told me you were drowning.
Was it an actual event?
Well, I don't think it was. If you read Phil's autobiography, it's called Not Dead Yet. He talks about writing In the Air Tonight. And he says that he literally made the words up on the spot in the studio. So, I mean, you probably agree with me, Eric. Like, interpreting lyrics is really fraught with danger because you could put whatever colour you want to on that. I think most writers, to be honest, are just looking for a rhyme. That's probably right at the bottom what it is. And I don't think it's the lyrics that make that song, though. I think it's the simplicity of the arrangement. So it was written on the piano by someone who couldn't really play the piano. It's only 3 chords. You sit at your piano, you play D minor, C, and B flat. And that's it. That's the entire song, just 3 chords. And it's the repetition of those that builds the tension. And you can feel with the way the vocal has got the reverb and the lyrics that something big is about to happen in that song.
He's had some songs over the years that, of course, a lot of people know and still remember, but that's the one that he's going to be most remembered for, I would say, right?
I'd agree. I saw an Eric Clapton concert in 1985 in Birmingham, UK, that is, not Birmingham, Alabama. It's about 100 miles south of here. And these were the days when you could buy physical tickets in a little desk somewhere, a little hatch in a shop or whatever. And I remember getting tickets for this Eric Clapton concert less than a week before the concert actually took place. And me and my friend Nick, we drove down to Birmingham, and Eric Clapton's band was himself, Phil Collins, the bass player Nathan East, who has played with everybody over many, many years, and the keyboard player Greg Fillinganes, who's also played with everybody. And that was it, a 4-piece band. And about 3/4 of the way through the concert, most of it was to promote Eric's new album, which was August at that time. About 3/4 of the way through, Clapton comes up to the mic and he says, well, we're going to play that song again. And then you hear the opening drum machine In the Air Tonight. And of course, everyone's neck, the hair on the back of everyone's neck goes up because we're about to hear not just this song, but that absolutely iconic drum break, which comes towards the end of the song, which is the simplest drum break you can ever hear. Because you and I can play it.
But it's the way it sounds.
It's the way it sounds.
I was going to ask you the origins of that sound. That is an interesting story.
It is. So we need to go back to the end of 1979 for the origin of that drum break. Phil was working with Peter Gabriel, in fact, on Peter Gabriel 3. Is that the Melt album? I'm not sure. But the 3rd solo album at Townhouse Studios in London. And Townhouse was well known for having a very lively drum room. So what that means is that the drums were placed in a room that was stone-faced. They were built of stone. So a massive amount of natural reverb in that room. And Collins was just playing around in that room, just biffing around on the drums. The engineer, Hugh Padgham, who became Genesis and Phil Collins' co-producer, he was pushing some buttons on the desk to make the sound different. And he pressed what's called a noise gate. But a noise gate cuts off an incoming signal at a certain time. So the sound of the drums was immense, but there was absolutely no fade and no reverb on the drums. It was like boom, no decay. Peter Gabriel used that on a song, the opening song on Peter Gabriel 3. If you listen to that, I think it's called Intruder from Memory.
It is Intruder, yeah, and you're right. It is the Melt album. It's the one
Melt album.
You see Peter's face melting on his left side.
So listen to the opening track for that, which came out a few years before In the Air Tonight. It's got exactly the same drum sound, and that's where it was invented for Peter Gabriel's album in the Townhouse studios in London. So that huge sound, but with an immediate cutoff, was the secret to that. They're massively, massively influential.
The buzzing guitar is from longtime Phil guitarist Daryl Sturmer, and Phil later said it sounded like an electric razor. Who, along with Daryl, made up Phil's solo lineup in the 80s? Was it a consistent lineup?
Yeah, pretty much. So, as we said earlier, the original tracks for Face Value were a bunch of demos recorded in Phil's bedroom. In the Air Tonight was originally just a simple drum pattern, but when they got in the studio, they started to overdub extra sounds. So that big drum fill is one of them, and the buzzing guitar sound that you mentioned right at the top of the song is another one. Now, Daryl Sturmer, extremely talented jazz musician, had been the touring member of Genesis for quite a few years by this point. I think he joined in 1978 as a touring member of Genesis, in effect replacing Steve Hackett. And I think, if I'm right, he's played pretty much on every Phil Collins solo tour and every Genesis tour since 1978. So that's, how's your maths, 44 years? 44 years of playing with Phil Collins. And when I saw Genesis last year on their final Domino tour, there's Daryl Sturmer, present and correct. So Sturmer's kind of been the heart of Phil's solo band ever since, really, since, I guess, November 82 when the first tour started. He took along Chester Thompson, another great jazz musician who also had been part of Genesis' touring band. So that was the nucleus: Daryl Sturmer, Chester Thompson, Phil himself. He added Peter Robinson, the keyboard player, and the bass player Mo Foster. So that was his original touring lineup. But I think crucially, he also added the Phoenix horns, so the Earth, Wind and Fire horn section. Many of Phil Collins' solo songs have this very upbeat Motown feel to them, and the horn section was very important to that. And one or two of the guys changed over the years, but for many, many, many years, Daryl Sturmer, Chester Thompson were part of that solo lineup and part of the Genesis lineup.
I'm thinking of Lee Sklar as a guy who was there he's the guy with the ZZ Top beard, the bassist.
Yeah, Lee Sklar, again, is another session guy who's played with everybody. He replaced Mo Foster, I think, just either before or after But Seriously tour, around about then.
Yeah, that's the recognizable guy there as a kid, always seeing that dude with a long beard. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, Phil he definitely had his lineup that he stuck with throughout, but of course we know he didn't abandon the Genesis lineup and his buddies in Genesis. However, there was a little bit of tension with Phil's bandmates when In the Air Tonight was taking off. That's when we're heading into the recording of the next Genesis album, 1981's Abacab. The guys were a little bit like, whoa, I didn't think it was going to be that big of a hit.
That's right. That's almost the exact quote, actually, from Tony Banks. So between Duke and Abacab, Phil Collins had a million-selling solo album. We mustn't forget that. That's massive to the way that the dynamics of that band. And he sold more with Face Value than Genesis albums had ever sold prior to that. And so there was, that changed the dynamic. I think Tony Banks is quoted as saying, we wanted Phil to be successful, but just not that successful, which is quite funny. And then, of course, with that success came a degree of control within the way that Genesis, the band, worked. So you get more of Phil Collins' writing input, obviously more of his musician and input as well. But, if you listen to Duke and Abacab back to back, I don't think the songs themselves sound, that different. Dodo Lurker, which is the opening track on Abacab, it could easily have been on Duke, no question. I think the difference is the production on Abacab is much more in your face. It's got that 80s gated drum sound that came from In the Air Tonight on Abacab. And there are fewer kind of proggy elements on Abacab than I had been on Duke and the albums beforehand. But, the title track, Abacab, great song. It was actually a pretty sizable hit in the UK, top 10, would you believe, in the UK as a single. They annoyed a lot of fans with tracks like Keep It Dark, I guess. They were booed for playing songs like this at the time. But Genesis were moving on. I mean, no one wants Foxtrot Part 6, do they?
And the songwriting experience did strengthen between Phil and the two guys. That comes out of Phil's experience as a solo writer. That contributes to the music from that point on?
Yeah, I think so. I would say that in the early 80s, Phil Collins was pretty limited as a composer. He didn't really play piano that well. He wasn't really a guitar player. Because of that, his compositions were necessarily simple. He didn't have that kind of complex background that both Mike Rutherford and Tony Banks had in terms of understanding the way that music fits together, and that he kept it much more simple. But what happened with that, I think anyway, that Banks and Rutherford also moved towards a simpler direction at that same time. No reply at all, straightforward Motown song, no question, not really anyway proggy whatsoever. That's all is a Tony Banks track. Sounds to me like Martha, My Dear from the Beatles, very commercial, big hit in America. Invisible Touch, if we go a little bit further down, that opening riff, that's a Mike Rutherford guitar riff. They all change together, really.
It's a credit to those guys, the other two guys, that they didn't let Phil's success break the band up. And on the other side, Phil as well. He could have very easily said, I don't need you guys, I'm good. I'm going to go off and do my solo career.
Yeah, but think about it, Eric. They were fighting for hit singles by that point for several years since Follow You, Follow Me. That's what these guys were after. Phil's solo success helped to drive that forward, no question. I'm sure they grabbed it and took it with them. In concert, they'd still play those long pieces, no problem, but they'd also continually have those huge number of hit singles, as you said at the top of the show.
Yeah, so maybe more credit to Phil for sticking around and making sure he was going to be loyal to his guys, because they have a tight bond to this day.
Indeed, absolutely. They toured earlier this year, in fact.
I believe that you said it in the book. Don't they raise Phil's drums up in the mix from that point on, too? They make sure that people can hear those drums a little bit more?
Yep, absolutely true.
Phil's drum sound is like ear candy. It's just like, I need to hear more of that. So I don't blame them for pushing it up in the mix. Move that knob up a little bit more.
Exactly.
Andrew Wilde is our guest to talk about his book, Phil Collins in the 80s, which is out now. Phil goes back to solo work with 1982's Hello, I Must Be Going. He does a cover of the Supremes' You Can't Hurry Love. He's got I Don't Care Anymore on there. Those are the two hit singles. Phil always seemed like a happy-go-lucky guy, but here we have some angry songs, most notably I Don't Care Anymore. Where was all of this anger coming from?
Phil Collins' personal life has always been very, very difficult, complex. It's my belief that the reason he was such a workaholic in the 80s was a way of not having to face that complexity in his private life. So I Don't Care Anymore, which is a really bombastic song, used to open his solo concerts with that, if you can believe. Lights coming up and him hammering away at that. It's directed at his ex-wife. So she was responsible for the composition of the songs on face value. And then with Hello, I Must Be Going, that I Don't Care Anymore is very much directed there. He comes across as a happy-go-lucky kind of guy, but I think his health today is a direct response from the difficulties in his private life, that he worked too hard and he's basically destroyed his body because of it. Still can sing. He's still got that glint in his eye, though. Yeah.
Do you remember the Rolling Stone cover with him on it, and he's holding a rifle? Or he's not on the cover, but he's in one of the issues where they did a full story on his deep depression in the 2000s, I want to say. The first decade.
Yes, and he retired from the music business for a long time. He's really struggled with problems with his back, which is why today he needs to walk with a stick and why he can no longer play the drums, but you just have to look back at what he's achieved in his life and that he's not dead yet. He's still with us to celebrate that,
The 12th Genesis studio album is the band's 1983 self-titled album, their biggest commercial success up until that point, thanks to the songs Mama, That's All, Home by the Sea, Illegal Alien, Taking It All Too Hard, hit after hit after hit. Mike Rutherford came up with the drum machine pattern for Mama, which I didn't know. I thought that was Phil's doing. And a couple Beatles connections that you cite. You write that Phil's vocals have a hint of John Lennon.
Absolutely, yes. So listen to the song Mama, one of my favourite Genesis tracks. There's a really heavy echo on the vocals, especially towards the end. And at the end, Phil practically shouts and screams, "Mama, don't go, Mama, don't go." And any Lennon fans who've listened to Lennon's Plastic Ono Band album, the song Mother, that's almost word for word from that album. Quite interesting how it matches up. That drum machine pattern is on the offbeat, which a drummer probably wouldn't do. It's very, very distorted as well if you listen to the opening few seconds of that song. I think that's typical, really, of how something experimental that Mike Rutherford thought of in this case can be made to work, commercially. You might not know, Eric, but Mama was Genesis's highest charting hit single in the UK, number
Really?
3 or 4. Yeah.
Wow.
You wouldn't imagine that, would you? But yeah.
Such a great tune. Yeah, that boom, boom, ba, boom, boom, ba, ba.
That's
It just draws you in.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the John Lennon Scream Therapy era that Phil was inspired by.
Is.
Yeah. Another Beatles connection is with That's All when it comes to the piano riff and the drums. The drums, I knew of this one. The little fill was like that from, let me guess now, Ringo on Come Together?
Yeah, it's very much a Ringo sound from kind of the tail end of the Beatles recording. For me, and I think I might have mentioned this earlier, That's All is very, very similar to Martha, My Dear from the White Album. If you listen to Martha, My Dear, and then the opening of That's All, there's a very, very definite close connection there. It's pure McCartney, and absolutely, it's Phil plays Ringo's drum patterns for sure, and that track, hugely commercial, great track. I know a lot of people who wanted Return of the Giant Hogweed, but so what?
That was something that they had to deal with. Up until this day, they're still dealing with those fans/critics. In March of 1984, Phil releases Against All Odds, Take a Look at Me Now, his solo breakthrough in the U.S., the first of his 7 U.S. solo #1 hits, 7 between 1984 and 1989. How did this song end up on a movie soundtrack, and did Phil write it specifically for the movie?
So the director, Taylor Hackford, was hot at the time. He'd done An Officer and a Gentleman around this period, and his next project was Against All Odds. They wanted Phil Collins involved in some way. And they met after a Genesis concert in Chicago. So this would be the end of 1982. Hackford asked Collins if he had a song available, but his songwriting bag was empty at that time. So he just provided a half-finished demo and a few words. The producers took it away and recorded the basic track without Collins' involvement at all in New York. And then Collins added some drums and vocals on a day off in spring 1983 in Los Angeles. So just like that, you could say Collins had his first of those 7 US #1 singles.
What a run. As we mentioned earlier, Phil did quite a bit of work on the side during the 80s, and you covered all in the book. By this time, he already worked with Robert Plant on 2 solo albums, 1982's Pictures at 11, 1983's The Principle of Moments. In 1985, he works with Eric Clapton on Behind the Sun. I believe he's not only performing on it, but I think he co-produced it with Eric, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Most of it, in fact, about 3/4 of that album co-produced, yeah.
And he works again with him for 1986's August, which you had mentioned that album earlier. And he was on Frida's hit single from 1982's Something Going On, Frida from ABBA. 1984, he records Easy Lover with Philip Bailey of Earth, Wind and Fire, another huge hit. He's also on No One Is to Blame by Howard Jones. And those songs, you could just, me at least, that sound, that identifiable sound, you just know when Phil was on a song by another artist, you could just tell. If you had to pick one project as your favorite, what would it be and why? A song or an album?
I think I'd go back to August by Eric Clapton. We mentioned this earlier in our conversation. As I said, we booked to see that Eric Clapton concert, and Phil Collins was there. They did play a lot of Clapton classics in that concert. Seeing and hearing Phil Collins, bashing the drums on White Room, for example, that was absolutely something else. So that kind of period is, for sentimental reasons rather than musical reasons, I'd go with August by Eric Clapton. But you mentioned some of the others. Phil played on a few tracks from Pictures at 11 and Principle of Moments, but he did tour with Robert Plant for both of those albums. And there are recordings available of how comfortable Phil Collins was in that drum seat there with that band. Frida's hit single, yeah, Something's Going On, sounds to me just like a Phil Collins song with a different singer on it. That was recorded in Stockholm, in ABBA's studios, Polish studios in Stockholm. And you're absolutely right. Easy Lover and No One to Blame, clearly recognisable as Phil Collins. The one I would go back to is a track called Woman in Chains, which is on the Tears for Fears album called Seeds of Love.
I did not know about that until just recently. Yeah,
halfway through, Phil comes in, unmistakable. Yeah, absolutely. I think that was 89 from recollection. So it's just about covers the parameters of the book.
Here we go again with another massive Phil Collins solo project, February 11th, 1985, No Jacket Required. His most commercially successful album, over 25 million copies sold worldwide.
Say that again, Eric. 25 million copies.
25 million copies sold worldwide. Number one in the UK, 7 weeks at the top of the charts in the US. Where did Phil get that album title from?
Oh, yeah, there's a funny story. So we spoke about Phil touring with Robert Plant's band in the 80s. And we go back to Chicago. Lots of things seem to have happened in Phil Collins' career in Chicago. So they went to a restaurant together on when they're on the tour called the Pump Room in Chicago. And Robert Plant, one of the most famous musicians in the world, was denied admittance to the Pump Room because he did not meet the dress code. The dress code being jacket required. So Phil Collins was obviously really angry about this and said something along the lines of, when I own a restaurant, there'll be no jacket required. It's a pretty funny story.
Did he ever talk about why his face is on the cover of these albums?
Yeah, I think so. I think the first album was called Face Value, right? So that's a double meaning. So when you take something at face value, you take it as it is. And he was presenting those songs to his audience at face value. So actually, it's quite a clever pun to have on the front cover of your album just a picture of your spotlighted face. And I guess the theme there was continued through all of his other solo albums for the next 10 or 15 years, I think, with different views of his face. And of course, when he reissued those albums a few years ago, he updated all those with pictures and reshot all of those of how he looked as a 70-year-old, which was quite brave as well.
I was going to say brave. Yeah, definitely. And I always looked at it as that great British humor. So from that point on, he's going to okay, my face is on the cover, but we'll do this side of me. We'll do you look at me straight on, my left side, my right side. Yeah. Or he's looking down, looking up. Yeah. It's really very English.
And he's not the most typically good looking guy either. So there's a bit of, in your face, which is another English phrase.
Yeah. And he always liked to have fun with that too. Like the I Can't Dance video. And he just, it's so funny. It's this little guy doing the dance with his buddies in Genesis. This album, No Jacket Required, includes the number one singles, Sussudio, One More Night. Also, the top 5, Don't Lose My Number, and the top 10, Take Me Home. I was so convinced that Sussudio was in reference to a guy who's asking out a girl, like, so do you want to go out sometime? That's what I always thought. And it turns out I'm wrong. What does it mean, if anything at all?
It doesn't mean anything, really. That's just it. So when writers block out verses, they use dummy words sometimes just to fill the beat and the rhythm. And Sussudio was simply a made-up word that fit the beat and the rhythm of the song. It's nothing more than that.
Yeah, that's like Abacab was just A, B, A, C, A, B. Was it just like the song sections?
Yeah, and the irony is that there were supposed to be 3 sections within that song: section A, section B, section C. So they were due to do section A, then B, then A, then C, then A, then B. That spells out Abacab. But if you actually analyse the song, it's nothing like that in the end. But they liked the way that the dummy words fit.
It is interesting how, not just Phil, musicians in general, again, like placeholder lyrics or just something that they're just going to run with because it sounds good. And then the fans read into it and say, "Ooh, this means something."
Yeah. You can sometimes draw reference from lyrics in songs, but the best thing to do is to assume it's simply there to make a rhyme or to fit the scheme of the story. One example you might not know about is the song "Take Me Home," which refers, I believe, to a patient in the mental institution. You listen to the lyrics, right? It seems so long I've been waiting, still don't know what for. There's no point in escaping. I don't worry anymore. You think, okay, where does that come from? And then I've been a prisoner all my life. I can say to you, take that look off your worried mind's an ordinary life. Those are the lyrics from Take Me Home. And Phil says in his autobiography that was influenced by the Ken Casey novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which is set in a mental institution. So, and then maybe we'll talk later about Another Day in Paradise, which again has a kind of a meaning and a story behind it. But we know this because the author has told us this. We're not actually inventing or supposing meanings to words where we don't know what they really mean.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. If you're a publisher or author of a book on rock and you want to be on the Booked on Rock podcast, contact us through our website, bookedonrock.com, or send an email to the Booked on Rock podcast at gmail.com. The last week of March 1985, he's 34 years old, and Phil Collins is at number one in the albums and singles charts simultaneously in both the US and UK. Then there is his legendary 2 appearances at Live Aid. He hadn't planned on performing at both London and Philadelphia, but this was as a result of being in such high demand, right? So
absolutely right. Absolutely right. It's interesting you should say that Phil Collins was at number one in the albums and single charts simultaneously. I believe, I'll need to do some research, but I believe only 4 artists have ever done that, maybe 4 or 5. There's the Beatles, I have a feeling the Monkees, Michael Jackson, Men at Work. Can you believe that? Men at Work had one big hit single. They pulled through the album and they were so big for a very short piece of time. But yeah, Phil Collins, 85, was asked to play at Live Aid. Now, this story itself is actually quite complicated. So he initially agreed to perform in Philadelphia and the American leg to perform solo, just a couple of songs at the piano. Now, his friend Robert Plant was also due to play Philadelphia at the Live Aid gig. So he asked Phil to sit in because he'd be there already. So far, so simple. Then Eric Clapton agrees to perform, and Phil there has another drum seat to fill. So he's there for 3 sets in Philadelphia. And then as the story goes, Sting calls him up. They'd worked together on No Jacket Required. Sting sings on there. Are you doing this Geldof concert? And Phil says, yeah, I am. He says, can we do it together? Well, but Sting's in London and Phil Collins is in Philadelphia. So they hatch a plan for Phil Collins to appear in London with Sting, which is what he did. They sang a few songs together, and to fly to New York on Concorde, go to Philadelphia for the American end of the concert and play with Robert Plant and Eric Clapton. At that time, there were no plans for any kind of Led Zeppelin reunion, which is a whole other story.
By the way, that's a long, long way to go. Was the song Sting was on No Jacket Required?
That's it. And they sang that together at Live Aid at Wembley in London. But there's a great story. Some people even now say it's a shameful. Phil Collins chartered a flight to go from London to America to play in 2 gigs because he's a big head and a show off. Well, no, he took a chartered flight from London. He was dropped off on the runway at Heathrow Airport in London and took Concorde to New York and then was transferred down to Philadelphia.
He met somebody famous along the way, didn't he?
That's the story, yeah. So he gets onto Concorde at London, and there is Cher on the plane. She had no idea that Live Aid was even taking place. Completely coincidental. And so Collins had to explain what was happening. And absolutely hilarious. She asked him if he'd get her on the bill. So Phil Collins as a booking agent for Cher is a strange idea. But in the end, if you watch the footage of the finale at the end of the Live Aid concert in Philadelphia, there's Cher singing We Are the World. So she got there in the end.
Great story. And of all the high moments in Phil's career in that decade, we do have a few lows like the Zeppelin set. Yeah. Phil's set with the reunited Led Zeppelin didn't go over as hoped. What happened there?
Yeah, so the original plan, as I said there, was for Plant to play a solo set of some of the songs that he played in his previous tours with Phil on drums. So there would have been no issue there with Phil just fitting straight in. But I believe Jimmy Page got wind of the concert that Robert Plant would be playing and cooked up a mini Led Zeppelin reunion. John Paul Jones was happy to perform as well. So the songs that Phil knew from Plant's solo tours were replaced with some of the biggest songs in rock history, and he had to play Stairway to Heaven and A Whole Lot of Love, songs he'd never played before. And I believe he kind of woodshedded the tracks on the flight from London by listening to them on his Walkman, which is never a great preparation for playing in front of millions and millions of people around the world. And then when he got there, he found out that Jimmy Page didn't want him to play at all. Tony Thompson had been rehearsing with him, Chic's drummer, I believe, but Plant wanted Collins on, so there was already straight away there was this pulling and pushing across. It's no fault of Phil Collins that Led Zeppelin's set that day was particularly poor. They weren't rehearsed. Collins had some kind of substance issue, whether it was drink or something else, don't know. But Jimmy Page apparently still blames Phil Collins for Led Zeppelin's particularly bad performance. If you buy the Live Aid DVD or watch the official Live Aid YouTube channel, there are no performances at all from that reunion available.
And didn't Robert kind of call Phil out at one point, I think, down the line, and Phil responded? I can't recall when.
I don't know whether that's right, Eric. Maybe, but there's no love lost between Jimmy Page and Phil Collins, I don't think, anymore. But I'll just drop this in, Eric. I'm writing a book about Live Aid for publication towards the end of next year.
Okay.
Which will include details of all of the acts, all of the songs, and all of the stories. So maybe in another year's time, we'll have another chat specifically about that one day. In 1985.
Yeah, that would be. There was a band I think I recall, Queen was there, weren't they?
They were quite good.
Whoa, baby, yeah. That's going to be a fascinating book. Absolutely. Yeah. The new book is titled Phil Collins in the '80s. It's out now through Sonic Bond Publishing. Will that Live Aid book be out through Sonic Bond? Is that what you said? Or
yes, it will be. Yeah.
Cool. Andrew Wilde is the author, and he's with us to talk about the book Phil Collins in the '80s. Phil scores another movie soundtrack single, and again, it's a hit, Separate Lives, for the film White Nights. That hits number 1. He makes an appearance on Miami Vice. Then he's back with Genesis for 1986's Invisible Touch. Here we go up the charts again. Number 1 in the UK, 3 in the US. Remains the band's highest-selling album thanks to the number 1 single, Invisible Touch. The top 5 ballad, In Too Deep. The top 5 Land of Confusion, which was backed by a classic video of the band as Puppets. The top 5 Tonight, Tonight, Tonight. And the top 5 Throwing It All Away, which I'm surprised it didn't hit number 1 in the U.S. I don't know why, but it should have. By now, Phil is starting to he's got to respond to critics who say Genesis is way too commercial. And he had a quote you include in the book about how it came down mostly to the lyrics. What did he have to say about that?
Yeah, very simple, really. So Phil says that Genesis began to break through when their lyrics became less story-oriented, when they became more personal. He tells a story that both Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford went to public school. So in the UK, that's a private school, so a fee-paying school. And that they, because of this, were much more, if you like, emotionally reticent, stiff British upper lip and all that stuff. Where Phil Collins was just, a guy from West London who wouldn't think twice about saying, I love you in a lyric. That's the difference. Banks and Rutherford would never say those 3 words, and Collins he wasn't hung up about it. And that drives quite a lot of his solo material, and some of those songs as well are the more ballad songs for Genesis.
The title track to Invisible Touch, I didn't know this, was inspired by a Sheila E. record?
I think so. If you listen to The Glamorous Life by Sheila E., probably her biggest solo single, you can sing Invisible Touch right over the chorus. Easy. You listen to The Glamorous Life and sing in your head Invisible Touch, and it's quite surprisingly close. I mean, I'm not saying there's plagiarism. I'm not saying it was stolen. They're very similar musically, and I just think it's surely an inspiration. Sheila E. was in Prince's band too, and there's a lot of musical synergy around the kind of late period Genesis, some of their tracks, and the way that Prince put his music together too.
You're a fan of Tonight, 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 and you say there's a Kate Bush connection in the riff.
Well, maybe it's a coincidence, or maybe it's just my ears playing tricks on me. But if you listen to the main riff from Tonight, 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 it sounds to me like a slowed down version of the riff that plays under the chorus of a song called The Big Sky from Hounds of Love. I mean, that just might be me in the way I hear it, but they sound pretty close. There's nothing wrong with that. Hounds of Love in my top 5 albums. I don't care if anyone wants to copy it.
And speaking of slowing down songs, that was cool on, was it Duke? There's a Duke song and a song on one of Phil's solo albums that Phil took a Genesis song and slowed it down.
It was the other way around. He sped it up.
He sped it up.
In fact, yeah.
Behind the Lines is the song.
Yeah, absolutely. So as the story goes, they were in the studio recording, rewound the master tape, and behind the lines, the way that it cuts across the playhead was speeded up, and it sounded to feel like a horn chart, like a horn part. So on his next solo album, he re-recorded behind the lines with horns at a much faster pace.
Yes, that's right.
You can hardly tell that they're the same song.
That's always interesting. I love those stories, man. I don't know if you can have something like that happen in this day and age with the way they record albums, everything digitally. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, serendipity isn't the same. You have to physically place every sound on your recording sessions now. You think you go back to recording of something like A Day in the Life, where they set off an alarm clock at the end of a particular section, and you think, well, would that happen in today's digital world? Maybe.
Phil made an appearance on Miami Vice in 1985 and 1988. He stars in a romantic comedy titled Buster. He's starring in a film. That's how big he is now at this point. For the soundtrack, he recorded the song A Groovy Kind of Love. And there was a bit of frustration with Phil there regarding the version of the song that ended up in the film and then the one that was released as a single. What happened?
So he didn't want any of his songs on the soundtrack. He wanted to be seen as an actor in Buster. He'd been to drama school as a kid. He'd appeared on the West End of London in Oliver a couple of times in the 60s. And he wanted to make his mark as an actor. He put his toe into the water, I guess, with Miami Vice. Character was called Phil the Shill. Doesn't mean anything in the UK, but he basically played a version of himself in there. Well, so when it came to Buster, the producers asked for a recommendation for a song from the 60s that would kind of fit this love story that underpins the Buster script. And he suggested A Groovy Kind of Love. It was originally recorded by the Mindbenders, a Manchester band. But Phil wanted it rearranged to be slower in the style of, say, Andy Williams. So the producers asked for a demo to understand, how he thought that would feel. They heard it, and then they insisted that he recorded it with an orchestra to play under the credits. So he didn't want to do it. He did it because the producers asked him to. Number one in the UK and the US. What can you say? So
in the movie, you're hearing just that demo version. Do you prefer, which is better? Which one do you like?
I don't like either of them, frankly.
No?
I'm going to be honest with you. It's a very dull song.
Yeah.
It just reminds me of the old joke about the corduroy condom. Maybe you can't broadcast that.
Yeah.
Kind of love.
I think I agree with you. Groovy Kind of Love is one that I can listen to if I'm putting on his best of. I don't mind. I'm not going to skip over it. But yeah, it's not. But it was a huge hit again. And he finishes the decade with But Seriously. He talked about that choice of a title. What was it that he said about that one, But Seriously?
So I think I would refer here to a section from his autobiography, Not Dead Yet. And this is what he writes. He says, my 1989 album, But Seriously, has that title for a couple of reasons. For one thing, on March the 18th that year, Jill, his wife, gives birth to our daughter, Lily, famous actor now, Lily Collins. I'm suddenly enveloped all over again in feelings of parental responsibility and doting fatherhood. I'm looking inward at my family, but I'm also looking outward at the world in which Lily will grow up. These thoughts are mirrored in the songs I've been writing, socially and politically engaged songs about, respectively, the homeless, apartheid, the troubles in Northern Ireland, and inner city unrest. You can divine my state of mind by my expression on the cover art, which as ever features nothing more than my face. I'm wearing my heart and my seriousness on my album sleeve. So there you go. That's what Phil Collins says around why he wanted to call his final album of the 80s But Seriously. It's because he was determined to be a good father and he wanted to tackle some social issues. And songs like That's the Way It Is and Another Day in Paradise exactly do that.
November 7, 1989, it was released. And this one went number one in the UK and US for 15 and 4 non-consecutive weeks, respectively. Another Day in Paradise is his 7th and final number one single. I Wish It Would Rain Down featuring Eric Clapton goes to number 3. Something Happened on the Way to Heaven, number 4. That's Just the Way It Is, top 30 in the UK. And Do You Remember goes to number 4 in the US. Another Day in Paradise came to Phil while he was on tour with Genesis. Can you tell the story?
Yeah, sure. That song has its origins on the 25th of May, 1987. Genesis flew from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. That was during the American leg of the Invisible Touch tour. As the story goes, Washington was snowbound. I guess unusually in May. I'm not sure it's necessarily that common, but the band were being driven from the airport, and Collins asked the driver, what about all these cardboard boxes that line the pavements in the shadow of the Capitol building? And he was told it's homeless. And it's so many homeless people so close to all that wealth and power. And that's where the song originated. It was criticised for being heavy-handed and moralistic. Maybe it was those things, but I think these things probably need to be said.
Is it Man on the Corner also about that same subject, or is that not?
Yeah,
Lonely Man on the Corner.
Yeah.
And I know
is that from Duke or Abacab? One of those?
That one would be from. No, that Man on the Corner is going to be, and there's another one I want to mention too in the 90s that he did, but Man on the Corner would be from the self-titled one, I would say. Let me see. Hold on. Let's see.
Oh, yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Man on the Corner is from Abacab.
Yeah.
Man on the Corner. And then in the 90s, he also wrote a song about that subject for, I'm trying to remember which album it would have been for, I believe, Both Sides.
Okay, I'm sure you're right.
Yeah, I think Both Sides of the Story is about that as well. So that was something
It's a common theme, maybe.
Yeah. Do you ever plan on doing his work in the 90s? That's an interesting.
No plans currently.
No, I mean, because it's an interesting decade in what he tried to do. He did try to steer away from that Phil Collins sound. He produced and recorded albums like all by himself, played all the instruments on both sides, and he did mix things up. I know, what was it, Babyface? He teamed up with him for the cover of Cyndi Lauper's True Colors, and
that's right.
It's he had some moments there, but like every
was the Disney stuff, maybe the Disney stuff was towards the end of the 90s as well.
That was. Like as his solo career in terms of his albums and solo singles are not what they were in the 80s. He's on the up as far as the Disney career is concerned. I believe he won a Grammy, I want to say. So he did just fine. But every artist has their roller coaster ride if you're on it long enough.
It goes in cycles, doesn't it?
One of the singles, by the way, on But Seriously was, I believe, inspired or was written for the Four Tops. Which one was that?
So we should remember that Phil had worked with the Four Tops on the Buster soundtrack, a song called Loco in Acapulco, which he wrote and recorded and produced for them. Phil was always a massive fan of the Motown and the sound of Philadelphia kind of era. So from there, Something Happened on the Way to Heaven was written for the Four Tops. It was written for them to sing in the film War of the Roses. I'm sure you remember that with
Michael Douglas, Kathleen Turner.
And directed by Danny DeVito. But it wasn't accepted as a submission for that film for War of the Roses, so Collins recorded it himself. It's actually quite important in his career. It was his last ever top 20 solo hit in the US. Something Happened on the Way to Heaven. So he had 16 top 20 entries as a solo artist between 1981 and 1990 in the US. 16, and absolutely none since.
Wow, what a decade. As a big fan of Phil Collins, I can't pretend as if I haven't heard it before. Genesis sold out when Peter Gabriel left. Too commercial, too pop. It's lightweight music for housewives. I think that's what you wrote in your book. I have a friend at work who teases me all the time. All I have to do is just say the two words, Phil Collins, and his eyes roll. Oh, here we go. You share an experience in the summer of 1987 in your introduction of this book that speaks to that. Can you tell that story? And what's your response to the critics?
Yeah, I absolutely can. So I was bought a ticket for a Genesis concert for my 21st birthday present for some friends of mine. The concert was on the 28th of June, 1987, in Roundhay Park, which is the big public park in Leeds in Yorkshire. So it was the day after my 21st birthday. I've got very vivid memories because the friends I came with had tickets in a separate section in the park. There's a raised section, like a hill, which you can pay a little bit more to go into. So I was on my own all day in a park full of people I didn't know in the rain. So it was really memorable for many reasons. And as we were leaving, or as I was leaving at the end of the concert to go and find my friends so we could drive back across the Pennines back to home, there was a lad kind of not much older than me. And he was crying his eyes out. He was really upset and he was sobbing. And he says, the Americans did that to them. The Americans did that. I'm thinking, that's an interesting theory. And that was kind of compounded a year ago today. We're speaking in the middle of August 2022, but a year ago today, I saw a tribute band. I don't really go for tribute bands, but this one sounded interesting. And actually, they played inside a large cave in Derbyshire, which is close to where we live here. There's a band called G2 Definitive Genesis. That's the name of the band, G2 Definitive Genesis. And they play Genesis's music from the 70s, from 1970 through to 1980. But they tend to kind of focus on the seconds out era, kind of 76, 77, which is an era I'm quite fond of. And the demographic at that concert a year ago today was really very, very clear. The singer, Dave Whitehouse, said, does anybody here remember the 70s? And then he paused. And he says, is anyone here in their 70s? Which made me laugh out loud. But during the interval, and this is the point here, I heard a punter there complaining that, the band are really good, but that singer sounds too much like Phil Collins.
Oh.
And that's what really, really wound me up, because Phil Collins' work as a vocalist, a songwriter, a drummer with Genesis, as a solo act, is often sometimes seen to be inferior to the earlier Genesis lineup with Peter Gabriel, right? For some reason, their albums from 1970 to 75 are preserved in aspect as the real Genesis. It sometimes seems to me, and maybe I'm getting on my soapbox here, Eric, but many fans of a music label progressive haven't allowed Genesis to progress into the 80s. And as I say in my book, it can be disparaged as lightweight music for housewives, right? And I've seen that. But in my view, why isn't there room for everything? You can enjoy Supper's Ready and you can enjoy Sussudio, right? If you only enjoy Supper's Ready and you don't enjoy Sussudio, you're missing out. You're absolutely missing out. There's no need to compare them at all, in my view. You can enjoy your 1970 to 1975 Genesis albums or your 1970 to 1978 Genesis albums, if you wish. They're all genuinely classics. But I think if you ignore what's happened since, you're missing out on a load of great music. So take your prejudices away and open your ears.
Think about it. If you open your mind or open your ears, as you say, you can listen to Genesis old school, Genesis with Phil solo, Peter solo, and you've got yourself a nice collection there. What did Peter Gabriel ever say about the Phil years of Genesis? Has he ever talked about it? Because I'm sure he's a little bit frustrated. He probably, because he loves those guys. There was never any bad blood. I think he just probably feels bad for Phil. Like, ease up on the guy, will you?
You know something? When Genesis played their final UK tour earlier this year, they played, I think, 3 nights at the O2, which is an enormous venue in London. It used to be called the Millennium Dome 20 years ago. And Peter Gabriel attended the last ever Genesis concert. He was there. And afterwards, some of the, there were comments on social media. We don't understand why he was there and he didn't get up and perform. I'm thinking, well, why would he? What is the reason for that last ever Genesis concert at all? To celebrate the fact that Phil can still stand and still sing and not be diverted by a guy who left the band almost 50 years ago and has never sung any of their songs since.
Peter's not there to make it about him. He was there to support his friends. Yeah, that's
absolutely. So I thought that was a really quite a cool kind of coda to the whole story. Is he was there, but he chose to stay backstage and show support to his friends.
Yeah, that's cool. One last thing to mention before we wrap things up, Andrew, there was another book you released since we last talked. It's Eric Clapton Sessions. What can fans of Eric look forward to in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of books coming out as well soon, so we can talk about those as well. But I'm a collector. I've always have been a collector, and I like to collect absolutely everything, which is why I've got something like 500,000 songs on 30,000 albums. So Eric Clapton has had a remarkable career since almost 60 years of success, really, as a band member and solo artist. Let's push aside his politics for now, which I don't necessarily agree with, and just listen to him as a musician. Since 1963, he's contributed to unbelievably about 200 albums by other people as a session player or a guest. So some are very famous, some are very obscure, some actually really unexpected. So a short list. He's played with Bob Dylan, Aretha Franklin, the Rolling Stones, Sting, Phil Collins, of course, Ray Charles, Kate Bush, Rod Stewart. He's played with the Beatles. He's played with all 4 of the Beatles as solo artists. So, straight away, that's a pretty impressive list. But then Martha Vellett and Jonathan Kelly, Corey Hart, Stephen Bishop, the Tony Rich Project, people you may not know, he's played with all of them. Toots and the Maytals, Hawkwind, Mary J. Blige, all the same guy playing with these people over the years. So I decided it was kind of time to pay a bit of a tribute to that, find the information, collect all the music. That took a long time, listen to it all, put it into context. So my book, Eric Clapton Sessions, details which songs he plays on, for which albums, for which artists since 1963. It's pretty much a successful second career for him, I guess. It gives you kind of alternative history of a very prolific musician. I'm just going to point out two songs from that book which you should go and listen to. Bob Geldof released a solo album called Deep in the Heart of Nowhere. Eric plays on a song called Beat of the Night, which is a strange kind of semi-rap. And midway through that, there's a guitar solo that burns like a handful of dry ice. Absolutely incredible. And the other one, which is kind of a similar period, really. I'm a big Pink Floyd fan, and I remember seeing Roger Waters tour The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, which I think was in 1984. I think that's right. Eric played on the album and on the tour, actually, as I saw that tour with Eric playing. And there's a song on the album. It's a difficult album, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. It's not particularly listenable. There's a song called Sexual Revolution. Let's take a stab at the sexual revolution. And Eric plays a solo on that is equal to anything he's ever done before. So go and pop onto YouTube, listen to Beat of the Night and Sexual Revolution by those two guys. And the book covers all of those 200 albums by other people and the songs and the contribution Eric played. It's good fun to do. It may be the first of a series. We'll see how well sales go with that, because you could do one for Phil Collins, you could do one for Rick Wakeman, you could do one for Lee Sklar, and so on.
Sure, that's something that Stephen Lamb was talking about when I had him on, just future plans. What kind of series can we do?
Yeah, exactly. I have a very good relationship with Steve. Basically, how it works between him and I is I can suggest a project to him. So the Eric Clapton Sessions one was my idea, and he'll say, "Yeah, that's a goer. Here's a contract," or he'll say, "Don't be silly, that will never sell." And great, straight away you know where you stand. I've got a contract with Steve for another 3 or 4 books currently. My next is due out at the end of this year. It's another in the On Track series. It's the Allman Brothers Band, a band I particularly love, who no one knows in the UK at all, apart from the fact they use Jessica as the theme tune to a famous TV show here. No one knows who the Allman Brothers Band is in the UK, and yet in the US, especially in the mid-70s, they were the biggest band around.
You're right? Talking to a big fan right here. Excellent.
Well, I've worked on this with the Big House Museum in Macon. So it'll be for sale in the Big House Museum early in the new year, and it's had the approval and the blessing, if you like, of the remaining Allman Brothers family, which is great to know. It's not official in any way, but it's had their blessing. They could have asked us not to do it, and they said that's fine.
Outstanding.
So that's good news. So that's due out at the end of this year. In the middle of next year, I have another On Track on the way, which is, now I'm going to throw this one, Eric. Do you know of Paul Heaton?
Paul Heaton? No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Do you know of The Beautiful South?
No.
See, these guys mean absolutely nothing in the US. The Beautiful South, who were together from 1985 to 2007, something like that, 86 to 2007, had huge success in the UK and across Europe. But they're a very British phenomenon. Paul Heaton, I saw him play 3 weeks ago. He sold out a stadium of 18,000 people in the UK.
Get out.
And he can't, no one could give him the time of day in the US. It's just the way it's gone. The way his career has gone.
This is what I love about doing this podcast is I want to learn about these bands and artists that in this type of situation where huge in another country. Now this, I guess if he had come along during a different time, during these days, might not have been an issue with the internet, YouTube and streaming and all that. But yeah, but there was that time where you had people in pockets of the world or just certain states in the U.S. or U.K. that were famous and nobody else knew. Yeah, this is going to be a good one then. I'm looking forward to it.
It will be a good one. The Beautiful South had 3 #1 albums in the UK in the 80s and 90s. Paul Heaton's most recent solo album was the #1 last year in the UK. So he's still hugely successful. I'm really, really hopeful. We're speaking here mid-August. I'm really hopeful to get an interview with him soon. That would be great. He lives quite close to me here, actually, in Manchester, in UK, and that would be quite a thing. But we're going to do the book anyway, and that'll be out next year.
For Sonic Bond again.
For Sonic Bond.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then the one after that, I work with an 80s progressive rock band called 12th Night. I wrote their official biography maybe 14 years ago, something like that. We've decided to do a follow-up, which is the official biography of their singer, a guy called Jeff Mann. Sang with them for a couple of years, then was ordained into the ministry and became a singing vicar, which is quite a story.
What a fascinating story.
Another one, we've got approval from his family to do that, so we'll be opening up their archives and scrapbooks and so on over the next few months for that. That's likely to be out in the middle of next year. Jeff died age 36 of intestinal cancer in 1993. So next year will be the 30th anniversary of his passing. There's a reason behind that. And then the Live Aid book will come out after that, and then another Eric Clapton one after that.
Outstanding. Looking forward to it. Stephen Lamb, by the way, we should mention, for those who may not know, Stephen is the guy who runs Sonic Bond Publishing, and he's the guy. A lot of the authors like yourself have known him for quite a while.
The strange thing is, I've worked with Stephen for quite a number of years. I've met him once for about 5 minutes.
That's it.
I've never spoken to him on the phone.
Really?
It's very yeah.
That's very current though, with the internet, emails.
I guess it is.
Zoom.
I guess it is. But Stephen and I have a great working relationship. It's very comfortable for an author to feel that I can go with an idea to him and say, "What do you think about this?" And very quickly he'll go, "Yeah, that's a good one. When do you want to do it?" Or he'll go, "Nah, don't be silly." So this great big long list of books that I'm able to keep pumping out, if you like, is entirely due to the faith of my publisher, thankfully. So I feel very, very lucky indeed.
Yeah, and I've said this before, but he was great from the very beginning when I started this podcast, just trying to get guests on, and he was always accommodating and helping me out getting guests, and to this day he still is. So it's great to have all the Sonic Bond publishing authors on. So that's Phil Collins in the 80s, and we got Eric Clapton Sessions. Those are both out now through Sonic Bond Publishing.
They are.
BurningShed.com is always best to get it in the UK, and then Amazon in the US, from what I remember hearing from other authors.
I think that feels right.
Cost-wise, it's best to do the BurningShed.com UK, Amazon US. Any social media pages you want to let people know about?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. Just look up Andrew Wilde, author. Come and say hello. Very happy to do that. You can probably find me on Twitter as well.
All right, Andrew. As always, thank you, and this will not be the last time we talk.
I hope not. No, as always, thank you, Eric, as well. I'll talk to you again very soon.
That'll do it for another episode of Booked on Rock. Thanks for listening. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.